Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers in arms, welcome back to The Rabbit Holes That Quack, episode number 6. You're mostly related to today's documentary, The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley podcast. I am one of your hosts, Brandan Jones, and joining me downstream on this adventure, the woman, the myth, a quack who doesn't blink, Miss Nicole Matthews.
Hello, listeners.
And if you are just joining us well into the future or in near real time, welcome. This is a podcast where Nicole and I subject ourselves to a random documentary every week and let that be the springboard for a larger conversation about the issues therein. If you'd like to drop a particular documentary into the hat for us to choose from, we'll be choosing them from amongst our patrons at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack, where you can also submit broader topics, comments, and questions for both this and our other sister podcasts, such as The Conversations That Quack, where co-host Efren Garcia and I do a weekly deep dive into the issues facing the Black movie protagonist. If you enjoy what you hear tonight, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack and becoming a patron of any one of our tiers that start as low as $1. But if that's not in the cards for you right now, that's more than okay. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice. And stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows, including a rebranded version of the show co-host Wade Flicken and I are doing, so stay tuned for that. And so, listeners, my fellow feathers in arms, without further ado, these are the rabbit holes that quack. The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley is a documentary about the story of Theranos, a multi-billion-dollar tech company, its founder Elizabeth Holmes, the youngest self-made female billionaire, and the massive fraud that collapsed the company. It was written and directed by Alex Gibney, for whom listeners may know from his work on Totally Under Control, Crazy, Not Insane, and Rolling Stone, Stories from the Edge, amongst many, many others. And as of this recording, The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley currently sits at a 78% critical Rotten Tomatoes rating with a 75% audience score. So about 3 out of 4 folks on both sides have considered this something that they enjoy. Listeners, last week, I asked Nicole about the heroes that we want to succeed so bad that we ignore all the red flags that their pedestal is founded on. So, Miss Matthews, the guru of celebrity happenings, why do you think that is? Why does America, why does the world look at these heroes, even though there's usually those like couple of people that are peppered in that are kind of like, I don't get it, and then those people just kind of get backhanded and shoved out of the party, the celebration, out of the VIP section. But why is it that we kind of look at people and we're just like, hey, this person is awesome, this is our messiah, this is our savior, even though there might be some things that seem some I's left undotted, some T's left uncrossed?
I think that is a deeply philosophical question, but I will attempt to give an answer, at least from my perspective. I think I do find it to be uniquely American in some ways, not to say that it's not a phenomenon that has happened, since the existence of Earth. I do think there are certain elements of, our lore and our history where you can point to similar examples of this. But I think, in the case of some of the things explored in this documentary, and in particular, the types of heroes that we see produced in America, I think it has a lot to do with the concept of the American dream. I think we've really perpetuated since the founding of this country this concept that really anyone can do anything if you set your mind to it, right? And that just sort of that power in being truly dedicated to either your craft or to your vision and getting other people to buy into that can be a ticket for success, and has been a ticket for success for, a lot of people. And so I think, at least from an American perspective, I think it is kind of born out of that. And it's born out of a reality in which a lot of people actually do this successfully and legally.
To quote a great philosopher, he states, well, to each his own. I chose my path. You chose the way of the hero, and they found you amusing for a while. the people of this city, but the one thing they love more than a hero is to see a hero fail. Fail. Die trying. That is from the great philosopher, the Green Goblin from Spider-Man 2. So I submit to you. Yes. So I submit to you in the Midnight Society. When you think about heroes, especially kind of in the last year during the pandemic, we had our governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, in sort of his seemingly meteoric rise and fall from grace. And then now there's sort of a lot of ambiguity surrounding Dr. Fauci, who kind of became America's doctor, who seemed very untouchable sort of over the past year. So it almost seems like society is really just sort of thirsty for a strong leader, and like especially one without skeletons in their closet or questionable decisions on their track record, if that's even possible, who has sort of yet to step forward. And like one of the things that I always have a conversation with one of my friends is how much the Obama years kind of ruined society, ironically, because I feel like there was this general sense of like peace and sort of everybody kind of relaxed. And even though certain problems were still certain problems, things, the way that society kind of publicly engages with a lot of these things seem to just sort of be kept at sort of a minimum threshold. And then after Obama, everything obviously kind of became very, very sort of chaotic and tribalism and all this kind of stuff. So it's interesting to kind of watch this. This was put together in 2019, and I think Theranos over the course of the documentary was about, I guess, from its prominence. It was, I want to say give or take 2010, 11, and through about like 2018. So it's interesting to just kind of see just sort of, again, like this rise of a hero, and of course a strong female hero at that. Do you remember sort of this scandal at all happening in real time? Did you follow Elizabeth? Because I think you had mentioned a couple of times that you had followed Marissa Meyer, just kind of aware of her. She's the one that did the Lean In book, right? Is that right or no? Am I getting those two mixed up?
I think you're mixing that up with Sheryl Sandberg.
That's
Sheryl Sandberg wrote Lean In, and Marissa Meyer is the
Yahoo person, right?
Woman who further drove Yahoo into the ground.
Yeah. That's interesting. I wonder if there's a documentary on her. Yeah, so like, do you remember this happening? I remember some of these clips seemed very familiar, and her face seemed familiar, but I couldn't quite place her because I feel like during that time I definitely wasn't really that engaged with Call It the News, which is kind of going about my merry life. But do you remember any of this happening?
Yes, 100%. I think as someone who works in the technology industry and then also a bit of a news junkie, I remember her and this story well. I think, for me, what struck me about watching this is the thing that I remember the most about her is thinking that something was up. I don't know what it is. I think just call it my own intuition, but also just experience I've had for years working with CEOs and founders. And I think that's what's interesting about this documentary. It really explores sort of a little bit of the smoke show that Silicon Valley can be sometimes. I remember in the beginning sort of watching interviews of her and finding her odd. And it was interesting to me that they actually addressed her not blinking, but I think that was one of the tells for me, going back to kind of the beginning of when she started to really see quite a bit of fame and praise, was just something immediately struck me as off. I think it was sort of, again, just something I've observed in people over the years, and that has become a little bit of a tell for me. So yeah, I remembered this. I was not surprised at all, I think, when the news broke that this company was smoke and mirrors. And so yeah, this was kind of a interesting throwback, I guess, to that time, and a re-examination of what was going on. I definitely did not fully understand the extent of it, though, based on the news coverage I was reading at that time.
Yeah, this story reemerged on my radar. There's a great podcast I'd encourage everyone to kind of go out and listen to, this documentary if you've seen it or do see it and kind of want to know a little bit more. It's called The Dropout. I don't know who put it on, but it's just sort of a mini series, audio series podcast that basically covers the same ground that this doc does, about just generally how there's a lot of eyebrows that kind of keep being raised. A lot of people sort of attempting to poke holes throughout sort of the entire process, but just sort of never really amounting to anything. But I think it dove, I don't remember who he was, and I was hoping that I would recognize the voice from the documentary, but there was a guy in particular that I think was sort of in her inner circle or just had a pretty prominent position that does some of the heavy lifting from what I'm remembering. And it was just interesting from that, again, that audio documentary, just him talking about sort of how the relationship changed and how it kind of just sort of slowly deteriorated, and how once the legal kind of process started to kind of happen, how he got sort of pushed out and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was definitely something that I definitely don't remember happening in real time. But as I said, that podcast kind of put it back on my radar.
Well, I think the other thing for me, like another reason that I remember it so well, and they touch on this in the documentary, but just like given that time period, that was pretty much like when I was really kind of just starting out working in tech and really starting to get deeper. And I think obviously, things have, I'm not going to say come a long way because they haven't, things have gotten better. Back then, I think women in tech was even tougher than it is now. I mean, and so I think that she was really kind of upheld as this shining example of a woman in tech that, was kind of, as they kind of explore in the documentary, was scaling this company and, the next Steve Jobs. And so I think there was this level of awareness amongst a lot of women just for that reason, because she was definitely being kind of put in that position of like, look at this shining example, and this is what we all should be striving for.
Yeah. So then, that being said, did you go into this then when you finally kind of popped this on with any sort of expectations? Were there sort of questions that you remember having from when you were kind of following the scandal, or just sort of random things that had popped up, or even just addressing exactly what you just said, just sort of, has she been referenced as a cautionary tale as the ongoing conversation about women in tech and that kind of industry has gone on?
Yeah, I think, she definitely remains to be in the news, which I think is interesting. I think that I definitely, a few weeks ago, was reading about the fact that she's pregnant, and I think she's now using her pregnancy as a way to hopefully get out of what probably is inevitably a conviction at the end of her trial. And I remember thinking that was sort of interesting. And then I saw another article that I also just find fascinating last week, that like some of the merchandise that they had as company swag is actually being sold on Etsy, and that there's like I think a lab coat going around for like $17,000. So I think going into it, it was more just the awareness that she still somehow, I guess, seems to permeate pop culture to a certain extent, which I find baffling. I think my expectation was really just, again, having more of an understanding of what exactly had happened. I definitely, through the news coverage at that time, knew that, she essentially had made certain things up and all of that. But I think the level of detail around the device they were actually creating, what was actually happening, how often it was failing, the realities of how that didn't actually work, I don't think those were things that I ever fully understood through the articles I read. And I'm also not sure I could have. I think some of the visualizations and some of the actual shots that they had did a really great job of illustrating just what a complete disaster this was. So yeah, I think going into it, I was just hoping to better understand what exactly she had kind of misled people about.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was, I wanted to understand a little bit of why and then a little bit of how. Because again, from that podcast, my memory is basically just, she kept convincing people that she had tech that apparently she didn't, and just that everyone kept letting that slide. So I was hoping to get more insight, I would say, into her, which I think the documentary doesn't really do, and I'll elaborate on that in a bit, but I just want to kind of, I guess, call it more deconstruction about her, of which I think he was the guy who featured her on the cover of like Forbes, I think is what it was, just had like a great line, which again, we'll kind of circle back to towards the end here. So let's begin. What did you think about the documentary as a film? Did it seem, this is probably the most relevant, I think, of the documentaries he's done so far. Did this seem fair to her? Did it seem fair to her sort of investors, the employees, the partners? Did it seem biased, kind of the point of view that this documentary takes on?
Yeah, so I think, like full disclosure to our listeners, I think often because of my schedule, I sometimes do watch documentaries in pieces. Wherever possible, I like to watch it in one sitting, but that's not always the case. And so I will say that I was extremely bored watching the first 20 minutes of this documentary to the point where I did take a break because I was struggling to get through it. I don't know if that was just the mood that I was in at the time, but I suspect it also was a little bit of the setup in the beginning of it. I just was struggling to see how this was going to be something that I was going to be interested in diving deeper in. I think part of the reason is because there were a lot of parallels that they were drawing in the beginning between her and obviously other famous inventors. And I felt that came a little bit out of left field. Like it almost kind of was introduced as a concept very early on. And I think maybe to your point that you want to explore later, we weren't given a lot of opportunity to know very much about her before they started to make those parallels. And so I think that within kind of the first 20 to 30 minutes, the reason I was bored was because I started to feel like, what am I actually watching a documentary about? Like, is this a documentary about Edison? Like, I was a little bit confused, I guess. That being said, I think, as it progressed, it did get more interesting in that they moved a little bit away from that concept and actually just started to really peel back the curtains on what actually had been going on within this company, giving us more opportunity to, hear from former employees and I think really just understand on a deeper level how this company was able to continue for so long and how some of the things actually transpired in the first place. And also, exploring as well as part of that, whether it was all sort of this intentional criminal, activity, or if it was more of someone, with a vision that, just couldn't really see the reality of the situation. So that to me was kind of the meat of it. But I think initially this documentary, for me at least, really struggled to get to that phase. I think in terms of, bias, obviously it was biased against her. But I do think that it did a good job of sort of taking us on that journey of getting to the point of ultimate skepticism. The reality is like there were a lot of people that were bought into this. And I think hearing from those people was really helpful and sort of seeing how, someone that was maybe working in a relevant field for some of the positions they were hiring for would have been drawn to the company, would have been kind of, looking away from, certain unanswered questions and how they could kind of become sucked into, her vision and feeling a part of something. So I think that was really interesting.
Yeah, I definitely feel like she was portrayed as being crazy. And my one criticism, sort of the craft of this documentary is, I feel like we just didn't get enough of her. And I was a little unclear as to, at first I thought, oh, this was them doing a documentary while like of her or sort of doing a profile of her that kind of just turned into a documentary. And I'm still not entirely sure because of obviously sort of the way things came together. It almost seemed like that was just sort of stock footage that they got from profiles or from sort of things of that nature, because it never quite felt like we got to sit down across from her and kind of to have these questions that were kind of like, do you understand that when you say things like this, it was a lie kind of thing? And to just hear her or see her in real time, body language, eyes and all kind of thing, getting a chance to be like, oh, I get why people, are kind of pulled into the charm, as is kind of often cited in, the documentary. But because we have the benefit of, knowing kind of how the story ends, it's also, she clearly has to know some of that. So why aren't, we get to sort of figure out what our conclusion is with that disconnect, because I think that they did a great job of like portraying scientists and engineers and even the media kind of being like, oh, we were enamored in the very beginning. We were just all about this story. And then as time went on and we started asking questions that any other person would be able to sort of ask, we just aren't getting it. And I kind of agree that this documentary it was a little rough in patches because I don't think it really had a lot to say that wasn't just something you could just read some of these articles that you were kind of talking about, and even the documentary talks about, and even kind of piece together from some of these news articles and some of these interviews and conferences that she did. And I feel like the sort of miss there was something they do gloss over very quickly in the first kind of 10 or 15 minutes, which is just talking about the setting in Silicon Valley sort of in general, because I think that was the part that actually did kind of make my ears perk up, because similar to some of the other documentaries we've seen with, especially like Hysterical, where you're like, oh yes, this is about, the female stand-up comedian, but I'm actually also just understanding the industry as a whole and kind of what that journey is. And I felt like this could have been a great opportunity to kind of say, hey, for startups, this is how difficult it is. You do have people with these sort of eccentric personalities and people who are trying to do this or that or the other. And it just so happens that in this particular instance, the weird person in the room wasn't Mark Zuckerberg, it was Elizabeth Holmes. And sort of this is her story, and like something of that nature to kind of be like, oh, okay, like I'm seeing what's going on now. But it kind of did the Edison thing that you kind of were talking about. And I was okay with that, because only with the extent of, hey, this is why she called it Edison. And then they kind of come back to her just kind of quoting famous people, but then they never really do anything else with it. So then it could have just been like some text on screen and we could have like moved on and kind of like dove a little bit deeper into something. Because the fact that it's called Edison, I feel like a middle schooler would know that, oh, okay, cool, like that's the guy who invented the light bulb. And then like there's really no other true significance of it, even though the documentary really keeps trying to be like, oh, she really idolizes these historical inventors. But then it almost, because we never really get a clear sense of her, the human, like we definitely kept getting this sense of her as the PR version of Elizabeth Holmes. So because we never get a sense of like who she is, it just kind of seemed like a arbitrary detail or like a footnote.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely will be projecting an opinion of her in saying this, but I do believe it to be true. I think the reason that the documentary wasn't able to do what you're saying is because I do think ultimately the assessment that was made of her is likely accurate. It kind of reminded me a lot, actually, in a weird way, and this is going to be a very dark parallel, of a recent Netflix show called The Serpent. Would definitely recommend to people. It is not a documentary, but it is based on a true story of Charles Sobhraj, who was, I would say, one of the most notorious criminals, just in the sense that he murdered people all over the world, and it took years and years and years for him to be caught. But I think that something that is exemplified in that show was how committed he was to his vision of what he was doing as something that was totally fine. And I think that that's kind of what you see a little bit in her. Like, there is this disconnect, this inability that I think exists for certain people to actually map back to reality. And I would suspect like there probably is something a little bit off with her in that sense. And I think that's probably why they weren't able to sort of, peel back that curtain again and show you the inner workings of her mind and what she really believes. And I think, there were parts of the documentary that touched on that. I think, one of the gentlemen that wrote about her had kind of had a scene in talking about like, would she actually sit there and admit to lying? And that in his mind, he doesn't think she would, that she kind of goes to bed at night still thinking that all of this is fine and that she hasn't done anything wrong, right? And I think that if you sort of lean into that belief, to me, it would make logical sense why the documentary wouldn't be able to explore that, because it's very hard to examine people like that. If you are disconnected from reality, if you cannot see that this vision or this idea you have is actually not practical, or that you're not delivering on it, and that people are calling you out on that, and you can't have a real response to it, I think that does say a lot about a person's mental state, right? And I think ultimately, even if they had secured an interview with her, I highly doubt it would have given you that insight that you're longing for, because I think it would have likely followed a lot of the same tune of some of the interviews they showed of her, in which probably nothing helpful would have come from it, right? I feel pretty strongly that she would have remained convicted in thinking that she was somehow right in all of this. Like, I don't think there would have been any sort of breakthrough moments or self-awareness that would have given the audience a payoff in terms of her understanding the extent of this situation.
How much of that do you think is directly attributable to her being a woman? Because I think one of the things that was sort of fascinating throughout this documentary is I feel like the only person that was like from on the advisement, on the board kind of level, that pushed back almost from the beginning seemingly was her medical advisor kind of person, the person that she kind of had gone to school with, that was like, yeah, what you're this idea doesn't make sense. And for listeners, it was it was a completely different sort of product. It was sort of this nanotech patch, which like sounds like very sort of science fiction. And the medical advisor basically was just straight up like this doesn't make any sense. This is not based on anything. Like, this is actually medically impossible. But then throughout the documentary, it's like, here's Joe Biden kind of praising her. Here's Bill Clinton praising her. There's the person who there's sort of the familial connection with the grandfather that was like, oh no, like she's fine. They can't convince me that, you're stupid. We'll kind of talk to that context later, but like, you must have made a mistake in doubting her. And you just see all these guys, just like guy after guy, investor after investor, just being like, she's going to be the next great thing. She's going to be this. She's going to be this. And again, like some of that is the story, but then kind of to the point that that's sort of the larger conversation that you and I always have, where it's like, how much is, that guy given leeway just because he looks like them, sounds like them, has the same religion, has the same class, has the same whatever. And like, I'm watching this and I'm just like, this is interesting because I feel like she's only getting away with this because she's a woman. And this isn't even like an attractive thing, because I think the thing that like seemed that I clued in on is the way that anybody looks at like the kid who is doing something like way beyond their years. Like when you watch these like old talk shows and stuff, and it's like a 10-year-old that's like talking about astrophysics or something like that, or just has like a really mature demeanor, and everybody's like, oh wow, like that kid's like really smart, like that kid's gonna go somewhere. Like that's kind of what I was seeing with like all these people kind of like looking at her and kind of the way that they were talking about her. But like, I just like, I'd be curious to know what your read is on that, because I feel like, and we'll get to like the actual science stuff because I actually have a perspective on that, but just like straight up from like the how much of her being a woman, and then some of the stuff that you were talking about of like there's even that context of like her being at that Fortune like the most powerful woman in the Fortune 500, I think is what it was, might even be in Fortune 50, and she's there, and like the person who was narrating over that scene was basically like, she's not even, she shouldn't actually technically be there, but she's being sort of exalted as that, and again without the scrutiny that a male counterpart, for instance, might have gotten.
I mean, I personally don't think it has anything to do with the fact that she's a woman. I think that, again, kind of going to like some of my earlier points, I think, and again, like I'm not a psychologist, but I think she's probably a sociopath. And I think, one of like the key traits of sociopaths is just not being able to have any sort of guilt or remorse for any sort of like harm or mistreatment that you've caused people. And I think that, you see that in her denial of the fact that, because they were misleading the realities of the technology, they were very likely misdiagnosing patients and, potentially causing harm to patients. And I think her lack of care and concern around that leads me to believe, like, most likely, she's probably has sociopathic tendencies. And so the reason that for me, I would say that I don't necessarily think that, it has anything to do with her being a woman is like, again, there's a lot of examples in our society of sociopaths that have done a really great job of getting people to sort of believe something that's just false and that kind of, is an alternate reality. But because of their charisma, because of, their vision, because of their passion, because of whatever it may be, they can kind of get people on their side. And I think you can even look at things like, Epstein, and, there's a lot of examples of this for men too, right? And so I didn't read it that way as much. I read it more of like, I guess a little bit going back to like the beginning of the conversation around, this idea of a hero. I think sometimes the unfortunate thing in our society is we do conflate heroes with sociopaths, and the unfortunate reality of that, it's easy to manipulate people sometimes, right? And I think especially if you have this sort of skill, which certain people have, and especially, the example I gave about the serpent, I think this guy was particularly skilled at sort of just swindling people, making people feel comfortable. I think she was particularly skilled at having this vision for something that wasn't actually medically possible and selling that to people, right? And going in and having that level of confidence and conviction that most people are going to believe it. And I think the thing that you'll see is that that could be really powerful in that you get a couple of people to buy into that, and there's this sort of chain reaction, And I think one thing they did a good job of is sort of touching on how prevalent this is in Silicon Valley. And again, I think this is something I personally have come across quite a bit, where it just becomes very easy to sort of misrepresent to an extent that you are not actually even capable of offering the thing that you say you're selling. And I think that, this is going to be a hard truth that we as a country, I think, are going to have to continue to confront, because we have created an environment where this is very easy to do.
Yeah, I think why, because I agree with what you're saying from the standpoint of sort of to sort of overgeneralize just the idea of the con man, like, the confidence man, where it's just like, hey, I can convince you of something. I can convince you of an idea. I can convince you of a lot of things. But I think why I think her being a woman plays a part, not again 100%, but just a large part of it, is because specifically this is medical. And one of the things that I thought was fascinating was there was sort of the guy, I forgot sort of what his specialty was, but he was kind of talking about how he's like, yeah, that's very common in Silicon Valley for everyone to kind of do this. But he's like, this isn't an email app. This isn't software. This isn't, sort of a web-based thing. He's like, and this is me paraphrasing, but it's just like, if you get this wrong, like, people could die, kind of thing. Like, we're actually like putting, like, people are putting lives kind of in the hands of this. And so he referenced like things that are going to be medical technology, and then he obviously kind of mentioned sort of the automated cars and all that kind of stuff. And so with the medical field in particular versus something like email or say like an ad platform or any of that nature, I would have just presumed that there would have been sort of a full stop moment for some of these questions that were sort of being asked of her that didn't, again, like not being a scientist, obviously, but having sort of call it a personal affinity for sort of science and just sort of education and kind of those things. There were like certain questions that I was like, yeah, I mean, that just kind of seems like an obvious sort of thing. Like, it's like, oh, well, I don't need to know the patent of like how this works. I don't need to know like, what the technology is. I don't even need to know like the details of like how the Edison sort of the device is engineered. I just need you to be able to concisely tell me, oh, well, what we do is like inside of that small blood, because we're able to kind of actually access the blah, blah, blah attributes of blood, we can actually run that test 200 times. Like a simple, like you could explain that to a fifth grader phrase, but then as the one writer later on said, where he was like, it was comically vague. And then when you're like seeing it and it's like, oh, the chemistry that the chemistry machine does gives us results. And you're like, that's weird. Like, that's like fundamentally weird. And as they said, it like tripped them up. But then I'm thinking, yes, there's absolutely the people who got enamored with sort of the story aspect of it and kind of just got swept away. But there has to be people like, the gentleman, the sort of, who was like the lead, like head scientist or head of the lab or something like that, that they kind of spoke with his wife. And just like other people had to have been asking questions or had to have been seeing results that kind of were like, hey, this doesn't make sense, but like, this should just be really easy to verify though. Right. And I think that's why, like, that's what I'm kind of like, there seems to be an added layer of, I can totally be like, oh yeah, that's a really cool guy, that's a da-da-da-da, but hey man, like, you never have money, so like, you can't come with us kind of vibe. And I feel like there was something going on with that I think she may have been able to slide, that like Zuckerberg, for instance, might not have been able to get away with, or somebody like that.
Yeah, but I mean, I think like not to take this conversation too off the rails, but I think you mentioned Zuckerberg, and that was actually exactly where I was going to go with this, where it's like, yes, I guess there's a certain element of like because it's medical, like it's maybe slightly more serious or more directly linked to impacting people's livelihood, but I would argue, and this is something you and I debate a lot, Facebook has killed people. I'm just going to say it. Controversial statement, right? Like, I think for me, like, what this illustrates is that it's not just about the medical industry. It is about the license that we have given to Silicon Valley to create companies with no thought, process, law, regulation of how it is going to impact our society, right? And I think that, like, medically, that might be a more direct example, the more direct link of, like, this exact product leads to killing someone. But an argument could be made that, like, Facebook has killed people because it's become a platform for terrorism or hate crimes or, hate speech that has made people go out and commit suicide. And I think, like, that to me is the more interesting sort of thorough line throughout this documentary of, like, this is a specific example for a specific sector, but I think that overall, this is a problem that this country is going to continue to face. And I think, like, another element of this that you see even, very currently is just how prevalent things like ransomware are becoming right now, right? Where, like, this is occurring across multiple industries. And the reason it is occurring is because we have propped up so many of our major industries on technologies that we never validated, that we never put any process in place, that we never put any regulation in place. Like, we have created this environment that is ripe for fraud. And I think, like, until we recognize that, you're going to see not just companies like Theranos happen again and again, but you're going to see situations like ransomware happening again and again, because we've just implemented widespread, not just technology, but social media. All of these things have become a part of our lives, and all of them are vulnerable. They're not just to, like, actual, again, like, online fraud and ransomware, but they make us vulnerable to other types of crimes and other types of situations that didn't previously exist. And so I feel like, for me, this starts to kind of pick at a much larger reckoning that we're going to have as a society.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I would say that's different between an industry like this versus social media is with social media, there's a layer of, we'll call it common sense, that is sort of up to the user, where that person goes, oh, like, you're facilitating an article that may be, not truthful, or this or that and the other. It's kind of a level or layer of moderation that may skew towards, one political leaning or one or the other. I think the thing that, especially as this documentary was kind of winding down, when they were saying, the whistleblower, for instance, when she was kind of saying, hey, like, some of these results are actually wildly inaccurate, and we're not, shouldn't we be telling these people who are relying now on our services that, hey, you might, again, me paraphrasing, you might not actually have cancer, you might be okay, or you actually may have cancer, you should probably go take that out. And, like, that was the piece of it that I was like, this seems odd that this went that far, because it's like, if you can imagine, and again, like, we probably weren't in that position of, we've both been fortunate enough to work with jobs that had sort of generous medical kind of packages, but I can imagine being someone who doesn't and goes, oh, I don't have to spend $1,000 to go get this test. I can go spend $15.99. Okay, like, this pain that I thought that I had is actually nothing. And, like, that was sort of the contract, if you will, the social contract between the customer and Theranos. Whereas someone goes onto Facebook and sees, a QAnon thing, which you can probably check out that documentary at some point, and then goes down the rabbit hole of that. But that's kind of like the customer can do their due diligence there. There's a layer of, oh, I can kind of continue to feed myself information to make a judgment call. Whereas currently in society, there are obviously doctors that commit, willful malpractice, but the assumption is that your doctor actually has your benefit kind of on their mind. And so when you kind of enter into a contract like this to kind of give blood, to kind of run any number of these 200 tests, like the syphilis kind of example that the guy gives, where he was just like, if 100 people come to us with syphilis, only 65 of them would actually know they have syphilis, and then the other 35 just kind of out in the world. Like, that to me seems absurd. And like, that's the piece of it that, like, and again, like, I don't think that's I'm not hanging that completely on the fact that she did that as a woman. It's also kind of just as a larger conversation, I'm just like, something seems very, very odd that was just allowed to happen, like, period. Because even when you remember some of the automated stuff, there was a ton of scrutiny where they were like, it was cool, but there was so much scrutiny of like, this is going to get people killed, this is going to do this and this, like, blah, blah, blah. Like, they're testing it in a parking lot. And I think Musk like pushed it a little bit far. Like, I think he was like, yeah, we're kind of doing some low key, like, country things and this kind of things. But it was like clear that he wasn't just like, oh, hey, I just released this car in the middle of rush hour arbitrarily to see what it would do. And so, like, that's the piece of it. I'm like, yeah, something's kind of like, I don't think that's just charisma, because it's like, that's got to be something to us, again, a certain degree, to bring us all the way back of like, I feel like somebody should have said something much, much earlier, even though, as a few folks kind of in the documentary said, they're like, everyone wanted this to be true. Like, and that's, you're rooting for this to be true. And even as I was watching this, I was like, oh, I wonder if someone else is still working on this technology, because, and we can get down to some of that in a bit, but I was like, this actually seems possible, but there are just certain things that, for whatever reason, and again, this is why I would have wanted to have heard her answer questions directly. It just seems like there were steps that she was just blatantly ignoring, and I don't know why. If it was like, cool, I'm being famous and I'm on this, or to your point, like, is she just legitimately a sociopath, or is she just legitimately, as that writer said, she just does not map in this reality for like her answers to essentially anything?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, for me, like, I just read that more as, like, again, an exposure of, like, the issues with the power that we give corporations and how Silicon Valley facilitates a lot of the creation of those corporations. Because I think, to your point, like, even if you think about the fact that she was able to go and get that deal with Walgreens, like, it just, to me, highlights how much it's always about money, right? And I think, like, to your point, it is a hard thing to be confronted with, to realize that, we live in a country where people's health can completely be kind of, botched and taken into the hands of people that have no idea what they're doing. But at the same time, like, nothing about that surprised me, because everything in this country is about money. And so even the Walgreens thing, it's like there was incentive for them to make that deal. So they made it. And for her, the incentive was obvious. She was trying to keep her company going. But whatever she was able to pitch to them, whatever she was able to sell them on, actually brought Theranos into people's lives, right? And like, to your point, that should have never happened. They should have never been able to make that step. But I think the reason that it did occur is because, we have structured our economy in such a way where people are ultimately just going to do what's most advantageous for their business, right? And I think, they touched on this briefly, and I wish they would have explored this a little bit more. But I think the reality is like, the people that are in the position of decision making, both at a Walgreens, but also in terms of like government, et cetera, they don't have the technical or the scientific knowledge to vet whether or not some of these things are true or not, right? But yet we've created an environment where you can be successful and not have people check you in any kind of way. So I don't know, like, to me, it made me sad, but like, I wasn't surprised at all.
Yeah, it's sort of a, and again, I think this was something that was, I think, explained with the student loan industry on the Patriot Act that we kind of spoken a little bit about last week. But there was this sort of interesting Bermuda Triangle of like paperwork where you have a company who's private, as she said, and so therefore they don't really, there's zero obligation for them to say anything until they're done, which makes perfect sense. It's like actually like a really, you know, reasonable logic. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But then it's like you do have the Walgreens sort of example where, again, like you would think even Walgreens would actually be like very, yes, there's plenty of money to be made here. Yes, like can you imagine a world where people come in to go get like trash bags and then they also get like a blood test that's just a prick on their finger and then they can prevent, you know, that headache, you know, untreated, unthought of for 10 months might have been a completely, you know, it's the end of their life. Like that dream makes sense, but at the same time, like you would think that there's a formula or just sort of the quote unquote bean counters over at Walgreens would be like, cool, we need to make sure that this works because the one person who walks in here and does it and then it doesn't work, that's going to basically end Walgreens and end like all of us because of how much money that's going to cost, sort of thing. And so like that's why like the medical side of things, there just seems like, and again, this is kind of just the perspective of me kind of outside of all industries really, and just kind of looking at what you would think would have a higher value, even when you kind of look at the way that, you know, sure, all of these vaccines could have just rolled immediately off the line and we could have been, you know, people could have been had arms and stuff shot in, but there needed to be some layer of clinical trials. There needed to be some layer of all these types of regulations, even to the extent of like emergency sort of approvals for use and such. That had to occur, but the fact that it doesn't seem like there was even that layer of scrutiny on Theranos for one reason or another just seems very, very interesting. And like it's one of those where on, again, to quote your favorite podcast or Joe Rogan, I think he was actually talking about regulation like a couple years ago. That was actually kind of an interesting, the way that he phrased it actually made me think about regulation a little bit more. Most people, when they hear regulation, they're just like, oh, it's just kind of like a financial thing, it's a tax thing, you know, rich America, blah, 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 blah. But he was just like, you know, like if you are building a, you know, if you're in construction, you obviously want regulation or else everyone's going to cut corners and costs. Like people would just like not do walls correctly. They would just basically set it up so that you could buy your house. And then maybe after like one terrible windstorm, all of your walls sort of like crack and all that stuff. And so he's like, I'd rather have really, really harsh regulation on like construction because we know that at least there's a minimum standard being met in order for that building to even exist. So there's a understood layer of safety. And so that was kind of echoing in my head with like this, because again, it's like, it's medical. It's one thing if it's, oh, do I really want to get behind the seat of, you know, an automated vehicle, kind of like to your point a couple weeks ago, that is getting there but isn't there yet because of human traffic and people just walking into traffic with, you know, their bikes and with dogs and with strollers and all the sort of cliche things, hot dog stands, or do you kind of want there to be a very, very stringent layer of checklist that like before that even gets into your world? Because how many people, you know, obviously we have the benefit of, you know, having this documentary in our head, but how many people were just like, oh, I heard from my friend that you can go to Walgreens and now get a blood test for like $20. Oh, okay, I'm just gonna go do that then. Like, I don't know that, like, I have no idea who Elizabeth Holmes is. I have no idea who Theranos is. I just know how expensive it is, but I can afford that, so I'm gonna go do that. And then, you know, you miss something or you think you have something, and now you're just sort of saddled with those bills. Which, fortunately, as the documentary sort of highlights, that everyone who got a non-prick, I guess, sort of finger ended up being refunded. But again, that's why I'm just kind of like harping on the medical piece, because that's very directly attributable to a death. Whereas I think with social media and some other industries, there's a layer of, you know, call it one or two more safeguards to be like, almost like, are you sure you want to delete this file kind of thing, as opposed to you just, oh, I thought I was fine because the test told me I was fine.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, for full disclosure for our listeners, that you are being sarcastic when you mention Joe Rogan is one of my favorite podcasts. I think everyone should know that. I think what you're talking about, though, was like, again, another interesting tension point that I do think that the documentary touches on, which is there is this element of us needing to have the ability for certain ideas, certain concepts to kind of be propelled in an unchecked way, right? Because we have these examples, and, you know, they reference Steve Jobs as one, but there's, I think, a lot of examples of this, of people that were told no, or people that were told your idea was crazy, and now because of that, it's something that helps us out every day, or it's the iPhone, or whatever it may be, right? And I think that in a lot of ways, that reality is something that worked to her advantage and something that she was able to sort of play off of, right? And I would argue she probably has a consciousness of it, because I think without a consciousness of it, I'm not sure you could have pulled off what she pulled off, right? And so I think that is why this is always going to be a challenge for us as a country, is like there are elements of needing to have things be a little bit loose so that you can foster innovation, so that you can break new ground and sort of expand the possibilities of what we can do from a scientific or medical perspective. But I think, to your point, it also exposes a lot of the weaknesses in the system. And I think that's going to become an increasingly complicated thing for us, because I don't think that things are going to get simpler in terms of scientific or medical advances. I think they're going to get even more complicated. And, it was interesting, like, it makes me think about, I was listening to the Daily podcast yesterday, and it was about the woman that really kind of pioneered the mRNA vaccine, and how this was something like she had basically come up with like decades ago, right? And it was just sort of chronicling her journey of people saying this is useless, or this won't work, or, whatever. And now something that she sort of believed in since she was a young girl is what is, hopefully going to end this global pandemic, right? And so I think for me, that's like another example on the opposite end of the spectrum where, you could kind of frame that in the same way of like, here's someone also being told you're crazy and this doesn't really work, or we don't believe you, but now it's saving millions of lives, right? And so that for me, I think, is sort of the challenge in coming out of this documentary, is like, clearly whatever we have put in place is not working, but how do you implement something that then does not stifle the next great innovation or the next great medical advance?
I think I agree with that on principle, that you do need to have and allow this space for people to break things and to fail spectacularly so that they can succeed even a little bit. I think the thing where this company and sort of this technology and this industry, where it gets, again, kind of me coming back over and over and over again to like who was asleep at the wheel, is even when they were talking to that engineer, when he was like, there are just things like from like a thermodynamic standpoint, he's like, that you just can't do in a box this small. And like, I remember as he was like saying that, and then even as they were kind of showing, what was going on inside of the box and everything. And I was like, I think the part of this that's fascinating to me, and like, this is when you get into the, again, why I would want to hear her specific answers to specific questions, is it's like, if you try to make an iPhone 60 years ago, it's just impossible. The components don't exist. There's no technology to do that. Like it's like, it would probably cost, $100,000 to like a consumer, like it's just impossible kind of thing. Could it be done? Probably a prototype version of it, sure, but the technology and just the understanding and sort of the learnings and experience required to do that just didn't exist. And so like in her example about mainframes, like, yeah, they took up giant rooms, and then someone eventually, as they kind of understood how they worked, they just got smaller and smaller and smaller. And so like, I almost wanted to have an engineer be like, yeah, we probably could do everything she's talking about, but it would probably be in like the size of like a 10 by 10 room. And then once we got that going, then we could like figure out how to like condense it. Cause that's generally like, I mean, for listeners who are video game fans, that's how all of those consoles work. When like they first come out at the start of a generation, they're always massive. And like, as that generation goes on, over the course of 5 to 7 years, they get smaller and they get smaller and smaller, and like quieter and like more efficient, etc. And so like, it just, again, seems like, as someone who is not, again, not an engineer, but just sort of like understands, there are certain things that kind of the way that things work. With her having a little bit of an engineering background, I think that she had mentioned up top, it just seemed like she would have been like, oh, well, we could sell you you know, that mainframe kind of component. And then version 2 is the size of, you know, a car. And then version 3, the size of a copy machine. And then version 4 is sort of like what we're talking about. And so like, that's why there's this like weird incongruous thought process for me, where it's like, even when you have all these people, it almost kind of ironically made me think of like, what do all these people at a company that on a startup just do? Because like, it seemed like it took a really, really long time for the people like the whistleblower to kind of be like, hey, like, what are we doing here? Like, this is like broken. And like the guy who was the intern and just like various other people and all that. But it just seemed like there was not an actual plan for her to work out that she was covering for. It just kind of seemed like she was like, yeah, this is the mission. And everyone's like, yeah, like we're not, of course, like we're all on the same page as that, but what do you want to do about these very, very practical problems that can't be executed exactly like the way that you want them? Do you want us to kind of go down this path so that we can keep iterating, or what? And like, there was just not really an answer for that.
I think like for me, I have a slightly different lens going back again to the fact that in my experience is the true like essence of Silicon Valley in some ways. And so like that was another thing that did surprise me, in that, you know, like I think back to like the very beginning of my career, like repping a lot of, you know, kind of digital media, ad tech startups. And, you know, in reflecting on that time, I'll often say that like we were doing business strategy. And the reason is like, the actual core work was, you know, a lot of like messaging and storytelling and things like that. But what I realized in going through those exercises is that our messaging and storytelling was actually helping to shape what the company was going to do. Because you start to realize how like so many, especially just like, again, startups in Silicon Valley, start with this concept that is not actually truly proven out, right? It's just this like hunch or an idea or something that sounds like it's going to break the mold or it's going to be revolutionary. And the reality is often falling short of that. And I think that sometimes what happens is that certain startups are actually able to go through this experience of either reaching the initial vision or having hired the right people and put the right tools in place to shape the company into something that actually can be sustainable, right? So maybe the initial vision shifts a little bit. But I think this sort of like concept that you can operate in the way Theranos did, to me, that is something I have come across again and again and again, of that like so many companies don't actually know what they want to be. They don't actually know how they're going to get there. You're kind of just operating in this day-to-day mentality and this week-to-week, month-to-month mentality of like, if we just keep marching towards this vision, we will find a way to make it happen. And I think like I myself have been fortunate to be a part of companies that were able to realize that vision, but I've also watched companies that competed with those companies or just other companies that were in sort of similar spaces fail epically. And so I think, you know, I think to me, like that was just sort of the fascinating thing about this, was like, it was just a much larger example of something that I think is extremely prevalent in the tech industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the call it disconnect there for kind of like between the, because I agree with what you're saying, but I think what you're talking about is what one of the guys says is he's like, there are the carpeted floors and then there were the tile floors. And he was like, the carpeted floors, she was a god. Like it was kind of like they all looked at. I think that's more of what, when I hear everything you just said, that's what I hear you talking about, because those like the carpeted floors was everything you're talking about. It was like, how do we message this? How do we go to market? How do we tell people what we're doing? What's our story? What's our brand? Like what's our, like, how do we do this sort of thing? Whereas I think I'm coming more from the tile kind of floor perspective of like, okay, cool. We all hear what you guys are saying. We've seen the TV ads. We've seen the news articles. We've seen our boss showing up on the covers of magazines and stuff. But like, what you're saying is directly in contradiction to like literally us as the working team of what we're seeing. And like, that's kind of where I'm kind of coming from, because like I worked for a company where there's an awesome chapter of that company, where there's kind of like a trinity of leadership, where there was the person who was very clearly the visionary, exactly kind of like how Elizabeth was, where it was like, I want to do X, Y, Z. Like, this is how I see things going, and this is how it's going to go, and we can do these like crazy things, and then we'll be doing this, and we'll be doing this, and we'll be doing this. And then another spoke sort of thing of that trinity was the guy who was just very much the money guy that was like, that's going to cost us this much. There's no way we're going to be able to get that much money. There's no way we're going to be able to do this. There's no way we're going to be able to afford this. There's no way, blah, 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 blah. And then the third person was the person who understood both levels and basically would always kind of take us to a place as a company that was like, all right, you really want us to go down this road. I think we could do it with the okay of sort of the money guy if we approach it in this way. And then it was like, cool, let's do it. And then like it would ripple out through the working teams. Then we would kind of get it all done. And as I said, it was probably one of the better working years professionally that I had. But then once that synthesizer guy left, the whole thing broke, because then it was kind of like, ridiculous vision, we can't afford it. Ridiculous vision, we can't afford it. Ridiculous vision. And then eventually the money guy left, and then it was like vision, and kind of the company kind of, you know, became what it became. And so that's why I was saying, like, I think like what you're talking about is Silicon Valley. Like, I agree with you. Like, it's like, that's kind of everyone's posturing. Everyone's trying to sort of figure out what's the differentiator. How do we kind of get up on these stages? How do we go to CES? How do we go to all these things? And basically kind of make it sound like we're the only people who get it. But I think from this standpoint, because there's sort of again, kind of to the point of the guy who was like, you know, if this was just an app, if you were like one more app in this particular space, you know, like everyone kind of knows, yeah, you can do this. Like, it's like, you really, what you're trying to say is this particular feature is going to be revolutionary. Like, it's like Spotify comes into the scene versus Pandora, and Spotify goes, cool, yeah, we are exactly like Pandora, but we are able to do this, and then this leads to that, and then that leads to more and more. And now they're kind of like two companies that are in the same space, but just very, very different. And I would say with what she was trying to do, because it was so different, and basically she was trying to create completely brand new technology, it just seemed like there was so much focus. Like, even the guy, because you could tell the way that they were questioning that creative, the sort of chief creative officer, like it was almost like the way that when we were watching the Fire Festival, like it felt like the line of questioning was like, did you even know that there was all this kind of like fraud going on? And he just kind of had this like vibe of like, hey man, like they pay me to like make stuff. Like, it's not my job to like whatever, which is 100% true. Like, he's there to sell it kind of thing, and just kind of make sure that it gets out there. But as I was saying, I just kind of felt like the tile side of that conversation was sort of, I wish we would have gotten more insight into that, because again, like I'm just as, you know, bought into the story of like, you should be able to finger prick and get all of these types of things. But I'd be curious to know if they would have been like, yeah, we were actually like legitimately 2 years away from that, if we would have blah, blah, blah. Or if they would have been like, yeah, there's just, we were doing our best, but like, there's a reason why no one's done this before, kind of thing.
I mean, I guess for me, I feel like we did get those answers. Like, I don't know. Away from it was that it's not possible. Like, I thought her former Stanford professor was very compelling and kind of, and again, I know that was a different idea, but her rejection of that to me said a lot about the concept of Theranos, in that I feel like they were bringing that in as almost an indictment of Theranos, of like also not being possible. And then I felt like a lot of the engineers that they talked to kind of were pointing at that fact. Like, I know it maybe was not explicitly said ever, but I definitely read it overall coming out of the documentary as like, what she's probably striving for is not technically possible. One thing that, you know, was kind of horrifying to watch, and like really, I don't know why it irked me so much, but just the visual representation that they had actually of the device and the blood kind of splattering everywhere. Yeah. I don't know if you thought that was as gross as I did, but that was really hard for me to watch, because I think it really did just paint this picture of how dangerous what they were doing was, and not just in like, you know, kind of mixing patient fluids and all of that, but just the fact that these people were working in an environment like that, you know, like that kind of disgusted me as well. Like, cannot imagine being a lab tech working with this machine that's just basically strewing blood and glass everywhere. That to me, I think, is something that really kind of is going to be cemented in my mind. This documentary.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was saying. Like, I felt like it was possible, but like you couldn't go from telegraph to iPhone. Like you had to go to like telegraph to like rotary to like, 80s phones, whatever. And like, that's why I was like, cause even the guy who was like the VP of product marketing or whatever, like he didn't give me the impression that it was impossible. He gave me the impression of like, hey, we're trying to figure out how to build a house and no one's ever built a house before, which means we have to figure out what 2x4s look like. We have to figure out what nails look like. We have to figure out what concrete looks like. And so this is just going to be a process. And like, that's why even when you had the machine and that guy, and again, like, who knows how much footage was left in the cutting room floor, like it felt like, because even just when you think practically, you could theoretically automate a lab if you automated it in a room large enough to automate a lab. Like in the same way that you could probably automate a like a car shop, but like you would need a warehouse to do it because you would need cars to be able to sort of, go from this section to this section. And then you would have to know that like it's been diagnosed already that it just needs new brake pads. And then you have the like in the same way that they have those giant assembly lines for cars. And now they still have sort of human elements kind of to them, but eventually it'll be completely humanless and yada, yada, yada. But like, that's why I was like, I feel like what she's talking about on the engineering level is possible. The only piece that they never quite answered, in my opinion, was like, can you do what she's talking about? Like the only piece that I was like, yeah, this seems odd is that you can do 200 tests by a drop of blood. And I think there's like one or two people who like asked that question and they were talking about I forgot what the word was. There's something in the blood. And like, that is the only piece that seems far-fetched to me because like you would imagine the reason they're drawing tube after tube after tube after tube is because of the nature of the way that these tests need to be run, parts per million and all that in order to get an accurate result. And if you're telling me that out of a drop of blood, you can eliminate all of that, that's where I would have a giant question. Like that, before you get my 9 figures of investment, I'm down with what you're trying to do. You need to prove to me right now that works, and I'm going to take it to an independent person. I don't need the technology. I just need to like be able to verify results in like a very, very extreme chain of custody. And then, yeah, cool. I'm completely in, yada, yada, yada. But like the engineering part to like actually what they were showcasing that was like breaking, with like the whole like withdraws from this and goes into that is just an engineering feat. That's just like, they'll figure that out eventually. But that blood piece seemed very, very dubious to me.
Yeah, that's, pretty much, I think for me, precisely why I came out of it thinking this idea is not possible. I thought that the 200 tests was interesting, and just like in terms of like the scale of that, but also just sort of some of the detail that they provided. I think that was why I came out of it thinking like that this is not something that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah.
I think they referred to it as the miniaturization that would need to occur in order to make that possible. And as soon as they started using that language, I knew it wasn't possible. Because whenever you start using words like miniaturization, it's something that humankind hasn't figured out yet. At least as it relates to blood testing. That immediately struck me as like, yeah, this is not real.
Yeah, it was as I was saying, it's like it all made sense. It was just almost like I think the thing that was also amusing about it, and this again, just the economy of documentaries and kind of the nature of what they are. It'd be interesting to go back to interviews to see if she ever actually spoke about the products in a way that felt knowledgeable. And what I mean by that is like early Zuckerberg, you were like, oh, and like it's it's known that he codes and used to like basically built it with the Winklevosses, depending on whether or not you believe the social network and some other things. Like he was very, very hands-on. And I think allegedly, the last time I heard like a few years ago, he even was still coding new features and all that kind of stuff. Same thing with Steve Jobs, very, very much was hands-on, used the product, constantly kind of interfacing with those teams about like, it should feel like this, it should look like this, like that kind of thing. I've kept feeling like, and again, this is just only what the documentary shows us, she was just kept talking about the mission. And it would kind of be the equivalent of like if Zuckerberg only like on those like commercial only ever was like, my mission is to connect people all across the world. And then when people were like, hey, well, what do you think about XYZ's like feature? And he was just like, well, and we're gonna, it'll help us, we'll, and then like have that layer of like, does he not that's kind of just a straightforward question kind of thing. And I never got the sense that she, again, with her engineering background that was like self-proclaimed, which I will, I guess verified at least by the people who were her advisors. Perhaps she was part of the Varsity Blues, Scandal listeners. Scoop. We just never got like a sense of where is your layer of expertise. Like, you don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be an engineer, you don't have to be a blood expert, but it would be cool to like see her in that environment with those heads of the departments being like, oh, okay, like, hey, we can't crack this because it's such and such, and her being like, it sounds like we need to blah 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 blah, like, let's look into that aspect of it, and if that doesn't work, then we should take it, like that kind of level, instead of just
I feel
story.
like, to your point, they majorly glossed over, like, I was kind of intrigued to know, they just were like, oh, and she dropped out of Stanford, and then suddenly Theranos, right? Like, yeah. I feel like there was this huge gap in them kind of explaining how we went from her pitching this idea to the Stanford professor that's like, you're crazy, to then Theranos, right? Yeah. Like, I think that could have been a little bit better explained. And to your point, through that, really understanding even, like, I don't really feel like they even address what she was studying at Stanford. Like, I think there were some things that, like, despite maybe her being a sociopath or not, that they could have at least provided for us that would have offered, I think, some helpful context going into the rest of the story. Like, okay, great. Like, she loved science since she was a little girl. Fantastic. But, like, give us a little bit more insight into, like, how did she make it into Stanford? What did she study when she was there? What made her drop out? How soon from her dropping out to then there, like, that sort of color, I think would have helped a lot.
Yeah, and it's like, again, similar to, I guess you'll call this a hot take, but it's like similar to the Varsity Blues thing where I was like, I almost don't care that these kids got in. Like, did these kids go on to like do anything that mattered because you took someone else's spot? Like, in this instance, I'm like, I don't care that she's a sociopath. Like, it's like, I think that's probably, everyone has shades of that that's in a creative or a very highly intelligence demanding field. I just didn't get a sense of like, why are you here to begin with? And that's kind of why I went back to like the, how much do you think there's sort of her being a woman attributed to any of this? Because it's like, I do think she's a great, well, actually I won't say I think. I got the impression that she's a great storyteller. I got the impression that like she could very much, like the guy who had the familial connection and wanted to intern where he was like, I'm literally staring at the machine that doesn't work. I can go talk to her, get amped up, and then come back to the machine and be like, oh, wow, that power. Like, I've known people who are like that. Like, I get that completely. So it's like, that's her ability to rally an army of 800 people and even raise money makes sense to me. But sort of as we were just saying, like, it would have been interesting to at least have seen her in the context of these working sort of situations, which, probably wouldn't have happened based on her being like, we have to be paranoid, we can't, trade secrets and yada, yada. Which brings me back to the thing I teased kind of early on. Like, I actually haven't laughed, I think, that loud at a line that was sort of unintentionally funny, but the Forbes writer, I think that's what it was, but the older guy who wrote that initial piece, when they kind of circled back to him, and he was just like, the Wall Street Journal released this crazy article that's basically dismantling your company, and like, he's just, I thought he was going to start crying. Like, I thought that's where he was going, but he's so angry, but he's like, so I guess polite, but like finally the only words he can kind of do, he's just like, you should be out here defending your company, but in reality, you're spending your day with honorary bullshit. And I just like, as soon as he said that, I just started like dying laughing. Like, I was like, that was actually like, that guy clearly was just like, all right, I'm done. Like, he's just like, we've been telling this story and I forgot how mad I am still. That was cool.
I also picked up on that. I laughed as well. I think he said something to the effect of, you need to be out here today saying what the fuck you're doing. Yeah. And I was just like, the emphasis on fuck was so well-timed and unexpected. Yeah. I also really appreciated the comment from the former Stanford professor whose husband, I guess, loves to say that excuses are like assholes. Everyone has one. Yeah. I thought that was also another great line as well. So just a little bit of humor laced throughout this documentary.
Yeah. Anything that we missed that you want to lob in with No Secretary about The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley?
No, I mean, I'll be honest in saying I'm a little bit on the fence whether or not I would recommend this one. I actually was kind of surprised to hear you say that the Rotten Tomato ratings were as high as. I think, again, that's partly because it took a while for me to really become invested in the story. I feel like they could have kind of cut out the whole. I personally didn't need the parallels to her being, the next inventor. It didn't really do anything for me. I think I agree with you that, probably that time could have been better used to try and give us a little bit more insight into like who this woman was. And I think even considering that probably was difficult for some of the reasons we discussed, I think there was some publicly known things like, why she dropped out of school, the timelines of that leading up to the creation of Theranos that just would have been helpful, I think, in sort of understanding this trajectory a little bit more. So for me, it's, I think if you are, someone who maybe followed this story, this could be interesting. I think if you follow, the tech world or Silicon Valley, this could be interesting. But I can't say this is going to be very high on my list of all-time favorites.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't recommend this one, mostly because I think it doesn't do either of two things. One, as we just said, I just don't think it really paints enough of a picture of her for us to kind of say, we get it, sort of thing, or that's a shame, or, just to really identify with her as a human being. I think, in a lot of ways, you can have serial killers you identify with. You can have great people who have done terrible things, terrible people who have done great things, and you just sort of understand that human nature is crazy, and context and nuance is everything. But with this, she just kind of was just a cartoon villain sort of the entire time, the way that she was sort of portrayed. And she may very well be like that, but again, I just think that there was a component of who she was that was just wildly missing. And then the other thing is, again, I think the documentary we watched, Hysterical, did this very, very well to a certain degree. The very first one, Fake Famous, and even the Nickelodeon one that didn't really have much of a point, did this well, where it was just like, hey, just tell us what the industry is then. Like, I kind of got a sense that, like, I wish I knew a little bit more, or this would have dove in a little bit more into medical startups in general. I feel like most of us know what's going on with Silicon Valley, even though it's gotten quiet kind of now that all the social media networks have sort of settled into their maturity sort of stage. But I think this would have been an opportunity to really showcase the rise of the medical kind of field and why something like Theranos was called the Facebook of its time or the Twitter of its time. And like, this is why it kind of broke out in the lead and was something that everyone was kind of quickly, were people trying to replicate this? Was it Theranos and then 8 or 9 other companies that were like, hey, we can do this too, sort of thing? Or I just think that would have been great context to have again seen when you have someone like Elizabeth and her boyfriend / CFO, I don't think that's what it was, but the kind of other C-suite person telling people that it's like, hey, like, we are changing lives. We are disrupting. We are kind of just the rallying the troop speech to kind of be like, okay, I get it. Like, that would have been cool. Like, I understand why you would overlook things, because if you're one of 10 trying to kind of elbow your way to the front, elbow your way to these contracts, the way that they were sort of, Snapchat was at war for a little while and then kind of before it settled in. And then you had Instagram that was at war until it got acquired. And just all these sort of like, oh, is this the Facebook killer? Is this the Facebook killer? We just didn't get any of that. And so like in the absence of all of that, I feel like you could just read the Wall Street Journal article and then the initial Forbes profile piece, and you would get the same amount of information that this documentary gave us.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, again, the reason you probably didn't get that competitive info is because this isn't actually technically possible.
Yeah.
So there were no competitors.
Exactly. With that, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers in arms, that is episode number 6. As you mentioned up top, if you enjoyed what you heard, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, listeners. Nicole, there was a stretch of time there where seldom a week went by where a batch of donuts arrived with your name on it. But
Oh, why are you outing me to people?
do you know the origin story of the donut?
Ooh, I'm excited for this one. Yes, I do love a good donut. I'm very particular about which kind, but yeah, big fan.
The origin of the donuts are coming soon. This podcast was produced by Pandora's Quack. She is Nicole Matthews, and you can follow her where?
You can follow me on Twitter at Nicole Matthews and on Instagram at Marie Coley.
And I'm Brandan Jones, and you can follow me on Twitter or Vero at Lamar Diablo. And these are the rabbit holes that quack. Good night.